Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for being here. We're continuing to truck through Matthew chapters 24 and 25. I'm looking at this as one unit because it kind of is one unit as Matthew is portraying it to us. It is considered to be part of the final great discourse in Matthew's gospel. If you were here last Sunday for Dr. McClarty's class, as he was talking about some of the similarities and differences in the four Gospels, one of the things he talked about as it pertained to Matthew is the number 5. And the number 5 is a particularly Jewish number, mostly because of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, as it's commonly referred to, the books of the law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And a lot of people, and you may remember we talked about this some at the beginning of the study in Matthew, how a lot of people view Matthew's 5 discourses as sort of corresponding to those 5 books of the law. And we are in the midst of the last of these discourses, or these big groups of teachings in Matthew's gospel account. This is commonly referred to as the Olivet Discourse. The reason is simply because Jesus is giving it on the Mount of Olives. No other particular reason for that. We read that in Matthew 24 and verse 3, that he's sitting on the Mount of Olives. And the general theme of this discourse has been judgment to come. And in particular, there's 2 events that Jesus is talking about. And it helps when we look at the context of what has been leading up to this. And so Jesus, he enters Jerusalem in Matthew chapter 21, and ever since he's been in Jerusalem, the idea of judgment has been a pretty prevalent theme. He goes in, first thing he does, as Matthew depicts it, is he goes into the temple, he overturns the tables of the money changers, the seats of those who are selling birds, and so on and so forth. And from that moment, there's been some hostility between Jesus and the Jewish leaders, and that climaxes in chapter 23 with the 7 woes to the scribes and the Pharisees. And so since Jesus has been in Jerusalem, he has been speaking very strongly against the Jewish leaders. In the first part of this discourse, which we're technically still in, we're going to finish, Lord willing, Matthew 24 today. In the first part of this discourse, there's 2 particular events that Jesus seems to be talking about almost interchangeably. And those 2 events are the destruction of the temple and the end of the age. You may remember the beginning of Matthew 24, Jesus foretells the destruction of the temple. And in verse 3, the disciples come to him and they say, "Tell us, when will these things be," these things being the destruction of the temple, "and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Jesus' coming and the end of the age are the same event. They happen at the same time. And so what you have here is Jesus talking somewhat interchangeably about 2 events. You can kind of see if he goes from one to the other, but a lot of what he has to say could apply to both. And Bert Kaufman in his commentary even goes as far as saying that the destruction of the temple is typology referring to the end of the age and Jesus' return. And so this is the first part. And actually, what we're going to look at in the rest of Matthew 24 today is sort of a bridge. We're sort of bridging between the beginning of this discourse and the end being where Jesus gives these parables about preparing for judgment. And the idea behind this is that judgment is coming. It's inevitable. It will happen. And so are we ready for that? And so we're kind of in this bridge point as Matthew 24 ends and we segue into Matthew 25. And keep in mind, this is all part of the same unit of teaching that Jesus is giving. And so we left off in Matthew 24 and verse 35, where Jesus says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." This is an important passage, and this could be a bumper sticker type verse where you could take it out of its context and you could make it fits, right? This is a true statement, and you could take it out of context and it's still true, but it has so much more meaning when it is in its context. Keeping in mind what Jesus has been talking about, heaven and earth will pass away. This is what he's talking about. He's talking about the end of the age. He's talking about when he returns and these things will be no more. heaven and earth will pass away, but contrast that with what he says about his words. My words will not pass away. And so the idea behind this is we need to be prepared for when heaven and earth will pass away. And we get prepared by heeding Jesus' words about it. And so that is what the rest of this chapter and consequently the rest of this discourse will be about, is being prepared or being ready for that day to come. So picking up in verse 36, Jesus says, "But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only." Notice he points out that day and hour. It's a specific day and hour that he's talking about. Well, what day and hour is that? Well, if you look within the context of this chapter, it's either the destruction of the temple or the end of the age. If you look at the immediate context, it's pretty clear he's referring to the day, like we read in verse 35, when heaven and earth will pass away. That's the verse immediately preceding this. So he says, concerning that day and hour, no one knows. And so this is the day and hour we can assume that he's talking about. Go ahead.
They have in mind that Jerusalem can't be destroyed, and the world go on.
Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense to them. And so they thought these 2 days would be identical.
Yeah. Brad points out to Jesus' Jewish readers, and especially his disciples, if Jerusalem and the temple get destroyed, it might as well be the end of the world, right? Well, what we'll see happen, 70 A.D. comes, the temple does get destroyed, and the church continues on. And Judaism, as it was in the Bible, really doesn't exist anymore. So, good point, Brad. So he says, concerning that day and hour, and what he says about it, no one knows. Jesus' point here, no one knows when it's going to come. And notice who he qualifies this with. No one knows. The angels of heaven don't know. Not even the Son knows. But the Father only. This is a very interesting thing that we see here. There's been over the course of history a lot of predictions about the end of the world. Many of you lived through Y2K. I lived through it, but I was only about 2.5 years old, so I don't remember any of it. I didn't know how to use a computer back then. Some 2-year-olds today might, but I didn't back then. And so you might be able to see on there, January 1st, 2000, all banks will fail. Food supplies will be depleted. Electricity will be cut off. The stock market will crash. Vehicles using computer chips will stop dead. Telephones will cease to function. Domino effect will cause a worldwide depression. Well, that didn't happen, right? The Y2K thing was a little overrun a little bit. And then recent years, we've had a few predictions. One that I remember is the 2012 controversy, the end of the Mayan calendar. What it was is they just ran out of room. And so a certain date in 2012 was the last day, and people thought, oh, this is going to be the last day in human history. And this book here about 2012, it says, the Mayan calendar marks the year 2012 as humanity's appointment with destiny and global change. Well, that's been 15 years ago now, and we're still here. And so because we're still here, obviously, it hasn't happened yet. And so every prediction up until this point has been wrong because we're still here. And so that's an interesting thing to think about. And as Jesus says, no one knows. People may think they know. People may think that they've got a secret formula to find it out. That's what the guy that predicted the end in May of 2011 did. That was some preacher from some denomination or something. He found a way to calculate when it would be. Well, that date has come and gone even longer ago in 2012, and we're still here, obviously. So no one knows. And Jesus goes on. He says, for as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Before we get into what he says about Noah, I want you to notice something. Notice he talks about here the coming of the Son of Man. What did he say in verse 36? In verse 36, he's talking about that day and hour, referring to verse 35 of the end of the age, when heaven and earth will pass away. Well, here, if you connect verse 35 and 36 with verse 37, we see Jesus is connecting his return, the coming of the Son of Man, with heaven and earth passing away. And so here again we see these two are the same event. And you can also see this as Paul lays this out for us in 1 Thessalonians 4 and into 1 Thessalonians 5. At the end of 1 Thessalonians 4, he talks about the return of Christ, the second coming. We'll meet him in the air and we'll go and be with him forevermore. And then chapter 5 immediately segues into the end of the age, the day of the Lord, as Paul refers to it there, I believe. And so he talks about these two being the same event. Some people may disagree with that, in particular the premillennialists who believe Jesus will come and then there will be a 1,000-year period and then the end will happen. Jesus does not make that case here. He makes the case that it will be one event. Then he talks about the days of Noah. He's going back to Genesis 6 here. As were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. He brings us back to the story of Noah and the flood. This is a story that's familiar to us. We learned it probably at a young age, if we were in church at a young age, at vacation Bible schools and so on and so forth. And so he connects his coming with the flood of Noah. So what is the connection? Well, we see it as we go on. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. What we see going on here, they're eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. We looked a little bit at this on Wednesday night. This wasn't Jim's particular topic, but we looked at what the state of the world was before the flood. And what we see them doing here, more or less, they're goofing off. They're not living the way they should. They're not living a life that's pleasing to God. That study that Jim did on Wednesday night, he talked about how you have on the one hand the sons of God and the daughters of man. The sons of God are those who follow God. The daughters of man are the ones who don't. They marry together, they get led astray, and the rest is history. Until we read in Genesis 6, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Notice how emphatic this language is that we read in Genesis chapter 6. The wickedness of man is great. Every intention, not some intentions, not even most intentions, every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil. Not mostly evil, only evil. Not just only evil sometimes, only evil continually. You see the emphatic language that's used here in Genesis 6. It reminds me a lot of a scene from the show Seinfeld. And I won't talk about the context of this particular scene, but Kramer goes into a bar and he's trying to entrap some guy into doing something, and he drinks a beer and smokes a cigarette at the same time, and he says, "Here's to feeling good all the time." Well, this was how they were living in Genesis chapter 6. This is the context of what Jesus is getting at here. You have people who don't care about what they're doing. They're just doing what they want all the time, no matter what. One of the things I tell people talk to me about the weight that I've lost in the last year, and one of the things I'll talk about is before I ate whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted, as much as I wanted. And most of the weight I've lost is just because I quit doing that. Well, that's the way they were living their lives entirely. They did whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, and they didn't care what it cost. They didn't care anything about it. They were fulfilling their desires. They didn't care anything about what God wanted. They didn't care anything about that. And this is the context of what Jesus is bringing here as he's talking about his coming. He goes on to say, they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. He talks about how they're unaware. When you're unaware of something, that means you don't know something. That's the literal meaning of the word. But something interesting here is when you think about that generation, the generation that got swept up in the flood, they weren't ignorant. Ignorant would be to say, you haven't been told something. Well, we read from Peter in 2 Peter 2 and verse 5, he describes Peter as a herald of righteousness. The idea behind that is, up until the moment of the flood, the people were warned about what was going to happen. And at the very least, they could see what Noah was doing in building that ark. They could see Noah making himself prepared for what was coming. And they willingly were not preparing themselves. And so here, as Jesus is using the word, you could say not only were they unaware, but they were unprepared for what was going on. This is the idea behind what Jesus is laying out here about the generation of the flood. They were unaware, not because they weren't told, but because they didn't want to listen. And they were not prepared for that flood that was coming. Despite the fact that they could have seen what Noah was doing, they didn't care. And so they were unaware until the flood came and swept them away. The idea behind this is that this is a very sudden occurrence. One day they're just living their lives. This isn't the type of thing that they could have forecasted. Sometimes we can look ahead to the weather and we can say, okay, it's going to rain on Tuesday. Better get the lawns cut before then, right? Something like that. I don't know if it's going to actually rain Tuesday. Don't take my word for that. But this was a sudden occurrence. They were unaware until the flood came. And by the time the flood came, it would have been too late. It's not like they could say, oh, we better get some lumber and start building. No, it was too late by then. This was a sudden occurrence. And what we see is they were reckless until they weren't, until the flood came and swept them up. And what Jesus says here, this is the connection. Just as it was with the days of Noah and the flood that came, just as it was sudden, just as they weren't prepared for it, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. What this shows us, Jesus' return will also be sudden. This isn't something that you can forecast. This isn't something that you can predict. This isn't something that comes with a strange formula that you can try to crack. There's not a code to crack in regards to this. It's going to be sudden. Jesus goes on, then 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and one left. One thing to remember, he talks about there's going to be one taken and one left. This coincides with the language that Paul uses in 1 Thessalonians 4, talking about those of us who are in Christ. You may recall that language, the dead in Christ will rise first, and then we who are left will go up, and there we will be with the Lord forevermore. We'll meet the Lord in the air, I think is the exact language that Paul uses there. And so we'll meet the Lord in the air when he comes. So just as Jesus says, there's one that will be taken, that will meet the Lord in the air, and there's one that will be left. And if you're left, you're in trouble. Because like we read at the end of 2 Peter, the earth is going to be destroyed. It's not like you're going to be left and you're going to be bored out of your mind. You're going to be swallowed up along with the earth. But people take this and they take it to refer to rapture things and so on and so forth. But that's not actually the main thing that Jesus is bringing out here. The main point is the fact that you have 2 men who are in the field, and you have 2 women who are at the mill. This is the main thing that Jesus is bringing out here, and the emphasis here is the fact that this is going to happen suddenly. Again, we see that there's not going to be any warning for it. It's going to be a very sudden occurrence. We're not going to be expecting it to happen. If you knew that the world was going to end on Monday, do you think you'd go into work? I wouldn't. I wouldn't expect anyone to. You wouldn't go into work if you thought the world was going to end. And so what we see here with this idea, if they're in the field and if they're at the mill, they're not expecting it to happen. But that's how it will be. We wouldn't go to work if we thought Jesus was returning. So verse 42 says, "Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming." The word "therefore" connects what he's just said with what he says here in verse 42. In light of the flood generation, we need to learn from them. The New Testament says that those things pertaining to the Old Testament, those things are written for our instruction. And so even though that's Old Testament, we can still learn a lot from that. And we can learn from their example of what not to do. And in this case, we need to be awake. We need to be ready. We need to be prepared. Don't be like the flood generation in the days of Noah. Don't be like them as you're eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage and carrying on. Don't be like that, but be awake. And awake again, referring to being ready or being prepared. This is the idea behind what Jesus is laying out here in this section. As we're bridging our way to chapter 25, where he'll make this same point repeatedly again and again by the use of parables. So he says, "Therefore stay awake." Reminds me a lot of the language that Paul uses in 1 Thessalonians 5. I didn't put that on the screen, but I'll read from there. In 1 Thessalonians 5, he's talking about the day of the Lord. And he says, "Now concerning the times and the seasons, brothers, you have no need to have anything written to you. For you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. While people are saying there's peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape." Listen to this. "But you are not in darkness, brothers, for that day to surprise you like a thief. For you are all children of light, children of the day. We are not of the night or of the darkness. So then, let us not sleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober." Paul uses the same imagery that Jesus uses here. And in fact, Jesus is going to use the same imagery of a thief in the night that Paul uses in 1 Thessalonians 5. He'll use that same imagery in a moment. But we have this same imagery here of staying awake. Don't be asleep. Don't be complacent. Instead, we need to be ready. We need to be awake. And the reason is we don't know on what day the Lord is coming. I've said frequently in conversations with people, if there was a date on the calendar that said the date of Jesus' return, chances are we would live however we wanted to live up until that moment. Chances are that's how a lot of us would live, which is probably why we don't know when it's going to come. We need to be ready because we don't know when he's coming. When I was at Harding, a couple times a month we would have health and safety checks in the dorms, and this was just to make sure the dorms were clean and so on. More for the guys, I think, than for the girls, because guys are slobs, right? And we had a particular RA a couple of years, the resident assistant, that would come and that would check the rooms. You never knew what time he would come and check. He might come and check it at 1 o'clock. He might come and check it at 10 o'clock. He might come and check it when he checks that we're there at curfew. You just never knew. And so he kept us on our toes as to when our room was going to be checked. So what that meant for us is we needed to have the room cleaned Monday night. Because Tuesday would come and we didn't know what time he would come. Same thing is true here. We don't know when the Lord is coming. And so we need to be ready. This is the overarching theme of this section. We don't know when it's going to happen, so we need to be ready. He goes on to say in verse 43, "But know this," this is that connection with the thief in the night. "Know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into." There's this imagery here of a house and a thief coming in. And this is a fitting imagery because this is something that we still think of today. Many of us have probably had thieves break in our homes. That happened to our house in 2011, September 2011. I was a freshman in high school. I was at school. My mom was home alone. guy came and kicked our door down. And my grandparents' dog that we were dog sitting, he was an ancient black lab and Doberman mix. He chased that guy out of the house, and we have an alarm system now. We're ready for when something like that happens. All of us, and this is a fitting analogy because this applies to all of us, if we have homes at least, which I don't think there's any homeless people here. We live somewhere, whether it's with someone or on our own or whatever. But we're all ready. This is a very fitting analogy. And again, we look at 1 Thessalonians 5. You yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. You don't know when that thief is going to come. You don't know what's in the mind of that thief. You don't know if he's staking out your house or the neighbor's house. You don't know what he's going to do. We're not mind readers. But that doesn't mean that we're not ready for when a thief comes. And this is what Jesus is getting at. If the master had known that the thief was coming, he would have been awake. And the idea that Jesus is laying out here, at least as I picture it in my head, is a thief comes, he kicks the door down, and there's the owner of the house waiting for him with some sort of weapon. Baseball bat, shotgun, whatever. He would have been awake, and he would not have let the house been broken into. And we do this today in various ways. We're ready for when an intruder comes, or at least hopefully we are, whether that's having some sort of weapon, whether that's a firearm or some other thing that you can hit him upside the head with, whether you have a guard dog, whether you have one of those really enhanced security systems, or if you have an ancient one like what we have at our house. It's several years old and it hasn't been updated. Some of you may even have security cameras. Or if it's something as simple as locking your door. We're ready for when something like that happens. We make preparations to try to avoid something like that happening. This is true of all of us, and this is what Jesus says his coming will be like. It's going to be like a thief coming in the night. You don't know when it's going to happen, but you'd better be ready for it, or else it's going to be a recipe for disaster. He goes on in verse 44, "Therefore, you also must be ready." We need to be ready just like the master of the house should be ready for when a thief comes. "You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect." Well, think about this. We need to be ready. If we're ready for thieves, like I assume most of us are, whether you have a weapon or a dog or a security system or all of the above or whatever, if we're ready for when a thief comes at our home, how much more should we be ready when the Lord comes? Because the Lord coming is of much greater consequence than the guy who breaks in your house and tries to steal your jewelry to sell it for money for whatever. Jesus' return is of much more consequence than that. You have a comment, Brad?
I just wondered what does he mean about being ready? What you know, he's obviously not talking about having a burglar around our house.
Yeah.
Something more than that. What does it mean to be ready?
It's a good question. I think he'll explain that with the parables in the next chapter, but the gist of it, and you could kind of assume this, is to have our life in order, to be ready with the Lord, to have, like Paul talks about, to have our salvation worked out with that fear and trembling, to be ready, to find ourselves faithful. You had a comment too, Garfield?
I just want to make a comment between 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians. In 1 Thessalonians it says, "The dead in Christ shall rise first, and we which are alive remain should be caught up in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord." Then you go to 2 Thessalonians, the first chapter, starting in verse 7. "And you are troubled, rest with us, when the Lord Jesus shall be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire, taking vengeance on them that know not God, and that obey not the gospel of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ." So he tells what's going to happen to the ones that are not in the body of Christ also.
I think that answers Brad's question. How can we be ready? Like he says in 2 Thessalonians 1, that's where Garfield quoted from in the second part of what he said. It's those who know not God and have not obeyed the gospel. They're the ones who will have vengeance, fiery vengeance, taken upon them. That tells us we need to know God and we need to have obeyed His gospel. So we see that the Son of Man is coming at an hour we do not expect. This is why we need to be ready. We don't know when He's going to come. So we need to have our house in order, so to speak. We come to verse 45. He says, "Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time?" The image conveyed with this is you have a servant of a house, as they frequently would have had at that time. We don't necessarily have that now. But you have a servant in the house, and their job is to make sure, say, that dinner is ready when the master comes home. Make sure it's ready so that he can get home, he can eat, and he can do whatever else he needs to do. And so he asked the question, who's the faithful and wise servant in regards to giving them their food at the proper time? If you come home, you don't want to have to wait very long for dinner if you're hungry. If you're ready for it, you want to eat now. And this is the image that Jesus uses here. You have a servant who is setting the dinner table for his master. A way we could think of it maybe today is when someone comes home from work. They say, "Is dinner ready?" Is dinner ready? If the answer is yes, then we can eat. If the answer is no, depending on the person, they may not be very patient. Things may not bode well. Jesus goes on to say, continuing this imagery, "Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions." So we're going to see a contrast here. There's two kinds of servants. There's the one that's blessed on the one hand, the one who when the master comes home, the servant who has things ready. Is the servant ready when the master comes? That servant will be blessed. He'll set him over all his possessions. So that's on the one hand. But then on the other hand, you have this servant in verses 48 and 49. "But if that wicked servant says to himself, 'Oh, my master's delayed,' and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards." Here we see he thinks he's got time. "Oh, my master's delayed. I've got time. I can goof off a little bit." Well, what's going to happen? So he goofs off. What happens when all of a sudden the master of that servant will come on a day he doesn't expect and an hour he doesn't know? What's going to happen to that servant then? He says, "I will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites." The servant's punishment will be severe. Make no mistake about it. This is a severe thing. When the master comes and you're not ready, it bodes very poorly. Cut in pieces, put with the hypocrites. He says, in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. We can assume this is imagery that Matthew has used pretty frequently. That place with the hypocrites is hell, or however you want to describe it. And so looking at all of this, and this will continue as we get into Matthew chapter 25, as he tells the parable of the 10 virgins, then the parable of the talents, and then there is, I don't know if you could call it a parable, but the image that Jesus uses of separating the sheep from the goats at the end of that chapter. As we get into that, as readers of this, both in our context today and also Matthew's initial context, as we're reading this, we need to ask ourselves the question, are we ready? Have we done what needs to be done for when the Master comes? Is the table ready? Are we ready for that thief to come in the night? Are we ready? Any comments or questions? Go ahead, Brad.
One thing let me think about it. Since one thing that is obvious. I'm sorry.
Think of it, and if you think of it, then get my attention again. CJ.
Has connotations to the destruction of Jerusalem, to especially one two women will be riding in the middle, one will be taking another. But you make a good point about the judgment. Could we also connect that to some Jews will be taken by the Romans if they don't flee to the mountains like Jesus had previously, and others will be left.
CJ, if you didn't hear him or understand him, he's asking if what Jesus has just said, starting in verse 36, the lesson today, if that could apply not just to Jesus' return and the judgment and so on, but also to the destruction of the temple. I would say it could, but that's not the context that Jesus is talking about, because he specifically does say in verse 37, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So he specifically attributes this to his coming. But then again, he does also tell them earlier in the chapter, like we talked about, to when you see these things happening in Judea, you need to run away, you need to flee. So you could possibly apply them to the destruction of the temple, but I don't think that's the primary context of what Jesus is talking about in this particular moment as he gets into all of this stuff starting in verse 36. Everett.
You know, I think about this chapter, I see the 2 days. Some people see it all as one day.
Yeah.
But clearly the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple kind of foreshadows the second coming, kind of points to that. You know, and I've heard it said this way, and I think of it as it is a judgment of God. God is judging the Jewish nation for their rejection of the Messiah. But the second coming is the judgment, right? It's not a judgment, it's the final judgment of all time. And we need to do everything we can to be ready, to be prepared to do what's necessary so that when that moment comes, we're ready to be caught up in the clouds, as Garfield mentioned earlier. So, but I see it as a judgment that points to the judgment. If that makes any sense.
Yeah. If you didn't hear Everett, he talks about how the destruction of the temple sort of foreshadows or points ahead to the end of the age, so to speak. And that's something we've kind of drawn out over the last few weeks, is the idea that Jesus could possibly be speaking of both events simultaneously at the same time. And the way he would do that is by way of double fulfillment. That's a pretty frequent thing in the Bible, where you have one prophecy or something that's mentioned, and it can be fulfilled in this certain thing, and it can also be fulfilled in that certain thing. And Kaufman, I think I talked about it at the beginning, it may have been before you walked in, that Kaufman directly ties this in with the destruction of the temple with the destruction of the world, and saying that it is typology working in that. I don't know if I would go that far necessarily, because there are some pretty important differences. But like you said, it's a judgment, the destruction of the temple is. That's certainly God enacting judgment against the Jewish nation for rejecting the Messiah. But then there's this other judgment that is coming, and in his words, it is the judgment. Go ahead.
It is. Judaism has never been the same.
Right.
It never has. They had a council in 90 AD to try to regroup, but it was forever changed.
The Judaism that existed in the Bible does not exist. It hasn't existed since the destruction of the temple.
It's a mere shadow of what it was.
And biblical Judaism doesn't exist anymore. It hasn't for thousands of years. Go ahead, Brad.
One thing is that it is so obvious that the things that he shows as an example are just an example. It's just a proportion of it. And it's so much greater that he has later on. That it just it begs the question. But the other thing is that I'm sorry, I've forgotten again.
That's okay. Brad, the first thing he talked about is how this example, I think you're talking about the destruction of the temple. That's very severe, obviously. But how much more severe is the final judgment going to be when it's brought in its full measure? I had a preaching professor in college that would say, for something to be fulfilled, that means it's filled full. There's no leftovers there. And that's the idea behind when Jesus returns. That will be the fullness of that. Everett, you have
And one other thing, and you may have touched on this earlier before I came in, but the fact that the destruction of Jerusalem occurred, right? We know it. That's historical fact.
Yeah.
Second coming, even though it hasn't happened, it's going to happen, right? It points to that this will take place.
We haven't talked about it today, but we talked about it in past classes, how the destruction of the temple obviously did happen. You can go to where it was, and it's obviously not there. So, obviously it happened. There's very good historical evidence about that. Even Jewish history talks about it. Josephus being an example of that. He goes into pretty big details about that. And the fact that we're still here means that the end of the age hasn't happened, and that also means that Jesus hasn't returned, despite what some may talk about with realized eschatology and all of that stuff. But I'm reminded, we talked about this before in Revelation 1, talks about when he returns, every eye will see. You won't miss it. It's not one of those things where you walk in the store and you walk out and people are gone. It's not like something you're going to miss. No one will miss it. Anything else? Steve?
Behind type thinking, this is actually saying the opposite. Because it says the ones that are taken here are the ones that were destroyed. So those series present the ones taken are gone and then the destruction takes place. But this says the ones that are taken are the ones that are destroyed. The ones that are left behind are the ones that are saved. So Noah was left behind. The evil were taken. One was at the mill, one was taken, one was left. They got that completely backwards from what this says.
Yeah. Good point.
Thanks for your attention.